G'day guys, I have just finished The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, and today we're going to talk about it. The Lies of Locke Lamora follows an incredibly likeable little band of misfits, also known as the Gentlemen Bastards, on their crime spree of general thievery and trying to con people out of all the coin they have. Everything seems to be going smoothly up until the point a person called the Grey King arrives, and then suddenly things really hit the fan and the story takes off. This book is known as a grimdark novel. There are some incredibly dark scenes and things that are raised throughout it, but Scott Lynch uses humour and this banter throughout the main characters, which makes it feel much more lighthearted and enjoyable than what it kind of covers. And this book is honestly probably my favourite book that I've read this year to date, and I think in the top couple of fantasy books of all time for me so far. So let's jump into a few things that I liked about it, a couple of things that I either didn't or that you may not like, and then I'll give a quick summary and my star rating. One of the major positives of this book is the main characters themselves. So the Gentlemen Bastards as a team, they are competent, they are witty, the banter throughout the characters, throughout the group, both inside of their group and to people outside of the group is hilarious. It is quite frankly, will keep you chuckling throughout the book, even when there are some really dark things that happen to the group and in the world outside of the group themselves. It's a really dark, gritty world, and the humour makes it feel a lot more lighthearted than what you're actually dealing with in this world, and it's a major plus. The character development. We see these characters grow up from young kids taken in off the streets, some of them, through to being probably early teens, early to mid to late teens. And you can see through their character development that they're a group of people who have grown up on these gritty, crime-infested, dark streets. And the character development is really strong, and if you're a character-driven reader, this book is going to be really enjoyable for you. On the same token, if you're a plot-driven reader, this book still has that as well. It's probably 50-50, I found, between fantastic character development, fantastic character-driven focus, as well as a really intriguing plot line that a lot of people, including myself, really bought into from start to finish on the book. One of the really major factors of enjoyment in this book is the world building that Scott Lynch does, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. Some of you will absolutely adore it, and some of you may find yourself bogged down by it. Scott Lynch has an attention to detail and an ability to write detail that surpasses a lot of other authors, and some of that detail is immersive, it's incredible. There are scenes where he talks about light bouncing off the buildings and the water, which just I, as being a film fan, found so cinematic and so enjoyable. But I can understand people who may find those parts of the book to be quite slow. I've heard a few mentions that the start of the book, people found the start of the book quite slow, while Scott really develops the economy, the religions, the way that crime and authority work in this city of Camor. And I found that all really intriguing, but I can see why people might find it a bit slow. The only thing I can say is if you are one of those readers who find it a bit slow to start with, this whole thing is all set up that pays off later in the book. So if you're finding the start a little bit of a little bit of a hard slog, I've found quite a few people who have found the start hard and then have really loved the book later on. Thankfully, I really liked the setup and the payoff. I think being probably a big Brandon Sanderson fan, you get a lot of that set up in his books, and so I'm quite used to reading that. But yeah, I think stick through it. The world building is really fantastic. It's not an epic fantasy world building like Malazan or the Cosmere. It is much more like Discworld, where it's the Guards section of Discworld, where it's set in this one city, and he has fleshed it out to an incredible degree, both for good and bad. Playing into that extra level of detail is Scott Lynch's prose. Scott shows some beautiful moments of prose throughout this book. Something to note though is that there is quite a bit of explicit language. You're living in a world where crime corruption, thievery, and con mans are the kings basically of this world. Like you're set in an underworld basically. So there is quite a bit of explicit language, and if that's something that you are sensitive to, be wary. This book has a lot of it. I found it really enjoyable because I think Scott comes up with a lot of new ways to banter and taunt other people in this world, and I found it a really enjoyable add-on to the prose itself. It's quite an informal language style, and as I said earlier, with the detail, there are moments that this prose may become a little bit too much for you. Towards the end of the book, especially when things start happening to our characters and the plot starts to speed up, there are moments where that detail can be a little bit frustrating. It's still fantastic, and probably on my second read through, I'll be able to appreciate that even more when I'm not trying to find out exactly what happens at the end of this book. So let's jump into a few things that I didn't like. There are flashback interludes throughout this book. The whole story is set between present tense and these flashbacks, and it jumps back and forth, which can be a bit jarring, especially at the start, to get used to. I found a lot of the interludes to be quite interesting at the start. A lot of them are based on our main characters as they're growing up and certain things that were happening, and I think they help to add to the world building. But as you get through the story, some of these flashbacks can start to be a bit time consuming, and you just want to get through them to get back to the main plot. There's one example where one of our main characters, one of our merry little band, gets sent off to a farm to learn more about the world outside of the city and how to impersonate different people outside of city folk. That main character starts their traveling there in this flashback, and then suddenly it comes back to present time and he's back in the city, and time has passed and he's back there. And I think Scott could have used maybe moments of introspection, or even his incredible ability to build banter within the group, to have had one of the other characters made a jibe or a bit of a joke about his time spent on the farm and what he learnt. And that would have done the same thing as showing us this journey to another place. I understand why Scott did it, but it just didn't really quite hit home for me. But I'm being really picky. Like, as I said, I enjoyed this book so much, and so any of these cons here are me trying to find something to talk about in this section so that you get a fully rounded picture of what I'm talking about. On the same side of that flashback there is a flashback where one of our other characters gets sent to the temple of a death goddess, and he learns to be an alkalite within that group. And what he learns there, and some of the things that you learn through that flashback, does play into the story overall. And so there's that side of the coin where most of these interludes are incredible parts of the story and play into the overall plot or the overall world building and have a real purpose. So those things are really enjoyable. As I said, another thing that could be a con for you, and I spoke about this as a double-edged sword earlier, is the over-description and the prose. These are things that I obviously found really enjoyable. I found them to be a fantastic part of the overall experience, but I know people could get really bogged down, especially early on in the book or towards the end when things start to speed up. So yeah, if you're someone who finds over description a bit flowery and painful to read, then this book may be a tough read for you. But to summarize, The Lies of Locke Lamora fits quite easily into one of my favorite fantasy books of all time, and that's a really big thing for me to say. This book could be a standalone book. Scott could have just written that and gone away and never released anything else, and I would have been incredibly happy with how the story finished. I think it is certainly its own standalone novel. It's not like The Way of Kings, where you finish the first book and you know there's supposed to be more coming. The Lies of Locke Lamora certainly wraps things up but still has enough loose ends to make you interested for further books. Finding out that Scott planned this to be a 7-book series, I'm incredibly excited to jump back into further books in this series. And so on that note, I'm actually going to give this book a 9.5 out of 10. I would give it a 10 out of 10 if I wasn't going to be so picky about books that I give 10s to. I think this book is rocketed itself up into my top 10, maybe even probably my top 5 fantasy books of all time. In personal enjoyment, I enjoyed it so much. I can understand why some of you may not, but if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it and I highly suggest that you do read it. There is some really dark scenes, but the humour itself makes it seem a lot more light-hearted. It's not usually something, if you described this book to me like that, that's not something that I would usually be interested in. But again, I absolutely love this book. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And if you have read it, I recommend going back and rereading it while you're waiting for other books to come out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Thank you so much to all my new subscribers. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate everyone's support so far. And I'll see you on the next video. Cheers.